there, and welcome back to Herstory, a place where you can get a quick history lesson on the go.
In this episode, we're going to be investigating the news.
That's right, Lina. We're going to take a close look into how news media is responsible for creating a platform for global communications. We'll dive into topics such as the influence of news media in the Enlightenment, Counter-Reformation, French Revolution, as well as more modern decades like the 1960s, 90s, and 2000s.
Join us on our trip back in time as we learn more about the news media and its influence in history.
In today's age, the news surrounds us daily. We're able to pick up our phones and turn on the TV in an instant and learn about the world that surrounds us.
That's right, Mac, but we haven't always had this luxury in the past. Prior to the Enlightenment, journalists were often persecuted and sometimes even killed for publishing stories that did not have the government-approved seal.
So governments often heavily taxed news outlets, which meant smaller distribution and even less followers. People received their newspapers once a week, and stories had been manipulated by the government censorship to ensure that they were non-threatening.
Wow, I could not imagine living in a world where I couldn't communicate my thoughts freely. We would be out of our jobs.
I'm sure that's true. Well, then thank you, John Stuart Mill and other influences of the Enlightenment. They were responsible for establishing freedom of the press and free speech, which meant that people could write and say whatever they pleased.
New trends began in the 18th century, too, which meant that morning tea accompanied by the daily newspaper was a ritual in most homes in England at the time.
And mass media was on the rise, too, and began to play a really important role in history. Mediums such as Mass media was on the rise as well and began to play a really important role in history. Mediums such as newspapers recorded events from the past that would have otherwise been ignored. Non-domestic stories meant that, for the first time, people could learn about events that were occurring outside of their own country.
Okay, we'll stop here. You can pause.
Intro music, so I know where we are.
Yeah.
In today's age, the news surrounds us daily, and we are... Oh, fuck my life, okay. Breathe.
Slowly, read it like you're...
In today's age, the news surrounds us daily, and, we are able to pick up our phones and turn on the TV in an instant and learn about the world that surrounds us.
That's right, Mac. But we haven't always had this luxury in the past. Prior to the Enlightenment, journalists were often persecuted and sometimes even killed for publishing stories that did not have the government-approved seal.
And governments often heavily taxed news outlets, which meant smaller distribution and even less followers. People received their newspapers once a week and their stories once a week, and their stories have been manipulated by the government censorship to ensure that they were non-threatening.
Wow, I could not imagine living in a world where I couldn't communicate my thoughts freely. We would be out of our jobs.
Isn't that so? Well, thank you, John Stuart Mill and the other influences of the Enlightenment. They were responsible for establishing freedom of the press and free speech, which meant that people could write whatever they pleased.
News trends also began in the 18th century, meaning morning tea accompanied by the daily newspaper was a ritual in most homes in England at the time.
Mass media was on the rise and began to play a really important role in history. Mediums such as newspapers recorded events of the past that would have been otherwise ignored. Non-domestic stories meant that, for the first time, people could learn about events that were occurring outside of their own country.
Oh, you know what that sound means.
It's time for rapid facts from the past.
Okay, let's set the timer to 20 seconds and see how many we can get through.
The oldest newspaper was established in 1605. It originates from the Holy Roman Empire and was written in German. This weekly newspaper filled an otherwise empty role in communication.
In today's age, the fastest growing means for accessing the news and information is in the mobile device.
Speaking of mobile devices, the Gutenberg printing press was the first time that text could be read and interpreted in the vernacular.
Time's up! We got some important things to note from that.
We sure did.
Mac, you mentioned something about the Gutenberg printing press. I thought it was originally created by the Song Dynasty, way back in the day.
You're right about that, Lina. But Gutenberg is credited for creating the movable printing press that many today regard as one of the key factors in fostering the Renaissance, Counter-Reformation, and the Enlightenment, as well as other impactful events of history.
That's true. Martin Luther took advantage of the spread of the news and led the Counter-Reformation with his 95 Theses. He argued that the Bible should be written in many everyday languages so that it could be interpreted by everyone and not only the clergy.
So, as you can see, the news has been vital to the advancement of global communications. I could even argue that if it wasn't for the push made by the Enlightenment and leaders like Luther, we could still be living in a world of censorship and fear to speak freely.
That sound means it's time to take it back. Way back.
It's time for us to examine the role of news media in the French Revolution.
The media played an important role in the French Revolution because it resulted in an unprecedented explosion of text, images, and oral communication.
Pamphlets and newspapers that multiplied by print were the driving force behind the incredible events. Now that censorship was gone, there was a flood of political journalism which quickly gained acceptance and interest by the citizens.
Instead of comprehensive books that can only be read by the highly educated and wealthy, the printing industry was led by short-form writings intended for everyone. The news networks grew and spread to over 6,000 Jacobin clubs across the country.
And so this immense support and popularity ensured supporters of the French Revolution.
So the news was used to express thoughts and ideals that would have otherwise been unheard?
Exactly, but propaganda and censorship still lingered.
Yeah, unfortunately, this so-called freedom ended quickly in France. Many today argue that Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the greatest masters in propaganda, since he often used the media to create a favorable public opinion of himself and his government.
And Napoleon took public relations to a whole new level. His influence seemed everywhere, from the theater to the newspaper to his own writing. His control manipulated the masses.
That sound means it's time to take it back. Back to today's age and explain why the legacy of news media is so influential.
Since the 1960s, news media has been ever-changing. At this point, the war had just ended about 15 years ago, and politics was a large factor.
Yeah, like in 1962 when JFK was assassinated on national television. This was pretty much the first time we had seen an assassination broadcasted for thousands. For weeks, news stations and newspapers covered this massive story.
So, in the 50s and 60s, the TV was a large part of the family lifestyle. We see dad comes home, mom finishes cooking dinner for everyone, and we all gather around the TV and watch the news and I Love Lucy.
Yeah, and it was the time also for the rise of instant gratification. As a society, we suddenly wanted information as soon as possible, whether it was via radio, TV, or even newspaper.
And Lina, we also see this theme again with the murders of Biggie Smalls and Tupac, which was on the news for months following the two deaths in the 1990s.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the rise of pop culture media in the 90s. By now, most news channels have websites for viewers to go and watch or read events from the day.
Yeah, that sounds about right, because when the 1992 dial-up internet was made, it allowed people to access internet in a much easier fashion.
That's right, so instead of waiting for the 5 o'clock news, you can now get it whenever you've pleased.
So bringing this all the way back to 2016, where we are now, there have been some major changes to news today.
Yeah, you're 100% right, Mackenzie. Today we have our smartphones, which are truly smartphones because we can access news faster than ever before.
I know, it's crazy. The Globe and Mail and all the other top newspapers have apps that you can download and have all the news at your fingertips. Some say it's taking away from the classic way we used to interpret the news.
But others say it's great because it allows a lot more people to get informed in a much quicker manner, which means that you can be on your phone and get the information on the go.
Speaking of on the go, since we are on a podcast, we should talk about podcasts.
Right, Mackenzie. Podcasts are one of the newest forms of news, which means that you can download them for free and listen to them on the go.
And so we strongly advise you to continue listening to all podcasts and this podcast to get your daily dose of history from the coolest historians you know.
As always, thanks for listening.